She followed every rule. They saw only her skin. What began as a routine drive home turned into a public reckoning that shook an entire police department. When one woman made a single phone call, the officers realized they had stopped the wrong person, but it was already too late. This isn't just a story about injustice, it's a movement born from silence. Backhand index pointing down. Comment below, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and tap the bell for more powerful true stories. It was supposed to be a quiet drive home. The winding roads of Silverwood Estates glistened under the streetlights, and the only sound was the soft hum of tires on pavement. Vanessa Monroe, elegant and poised in a floor-length sapphire gown, had just left a charity gala she helped organize, an evening dedicated to funding youth education programs. The city lights faded in her rearview mirror as she made her way toward home, eager to unwind with her husband and 2 sons. Her phone buzzed gently from the passenger seat. A smile crossed her face. It was Elliot Monroe, her husband, and the newly sworn-in police commissioner for Silverwood County. She reached for the phone, planning to let him know she was on her way. But then, red and blue lights erupted behind her, washing over the interior of her car like a sudden storm. Her smile faded. Puzzled, Vanessa glanced at the speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't run a red light. Her hands had been on the wheel the whole time. Still, she instinctively eased off the gas and pulled over to the shoulder. As she rolled down her window, a tall officer with an unreadable face stepped into the beam of her headlights. "License and registration," he said curtly, without a trace of politeness. The authority in his voice wasn't the kind that ensured safety. It was the kind that assumed guilt. Vanessa complied, her hands steady, though her heart beat faster. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" she asked, keeping her tone calm. The officer didn't blink. "Your vehicle matches the description of a car reported for suspicious activity," he said. His voice was cold, mechanical. A chill crept into her spine. "That must be a mistake," she said carefully. "I just left a charity event at the Silverwood Civic Hall." He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back and radioed something into his shoulder mic. "Step out of the car, ma'am." Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't routine. Before she could even reach for the door handle, another cruiser pulled up behind her. 2 more officers stepped out, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Their presence felt less like backup and more like intimidation. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She remembered the conversations she'd had with Elliot about what to do in situations like this: keep movement slow, voice calm, and never escalate. Still, as she opened the door and stepped out into the harsh glare of the floodlights, her poise was the only armor she had left. The fabric of her gown shimmered under the light, but the dignity she wore far outweighed the dress. She stood tall, silent, and uneasy as suspicion gathered around her like storm clouds. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would soon shake an entire community. The beam of the officer's flashlights flickered across Vanessa Monroe's face, illuminating the subtle sheen of unease in her eyes. She stood quietly beside her car, hands visible, breathing carefully. Her years as the wife of a law enforcement leader had taught her how to act in tense situations. But even knowing the protocols couldn't erase the sting of being treated like a suspect without cause. One of the officers had begun rifling through her vehicle without even a word of permission. The rear door opened. Then the trunk. Fundraiser brochures, her clutch, and carefully packed decorations from the event were all tossed aside without regard. Vanessa's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'd like to call my husband," she said firmly, the calmness in her voice belying the humiliation that burned beneath her skin. One officer, young, impatient, scoffed. "That won't be necessary." That was the moment her patience began to wear thin. Slowly, she stepped away from the beam of one flashlight and moved toward the passenger seat. Her phone was still buzzing from Elliot's missed calls. With deliberate movements, she picked it up and dialed. Across town, Elliot Monroe had just returned from his final meeting of the day. Still in uniform, he was scrolling through the news when his phone lit up. When he saw Vanessa's name, a surge of relief washed over him, until he heard her voice. "Elliot," she said, her tone low and composed, but unmistakably tense. "I've been pulled over. They're searching my car without a warrant. I haven't done anything wrong." The words hit him like ice water. "Where are you?" he asked immediately, already reaching for his keys. She gave him the street name and cross-section. Her voice cracked just slightly. "Please hurry." Elliot's SUV roared out of the driveway minutes later, sirens off but lights flashing. His mind moved a mile a minute, torn between fury and fear. He had dealt with countless cases of misconduct in his career. But now it wasn't paperwork. It was personal. It was his wife standing on the side of the road, being treated like a criminal in a town he had sworn to protect. Back at the scene, a small crowd had begun to gather, neighbors stepping out of their homes, passers-by slowing their cars, and more than one person lifting a phone to record. Vanessa stood still, arms crossed, watching as her car was handled like contraband. Then came the moment the officers hadn't anticipated. From down the street came a sleek black SUV. It stopped with precision, and out stepped a tall black man in a sharp navy blue suit, his police commissioner badge gleaming under the streetlights. Elliot's presence hit like a shockwave. Every officer on site straightened instinctively. "Good evening," Elliot said as he approached. His voice was calm, but carried a steel edge. "I'm Elliot Monroe, Commissioner of the Silverwood County Police Department. Would someone like to explain why my wife is being detained, and why her vehicle is being searched without probable cause?" The lead officer, a grizzled veteran with a clenched jaw, stiffened. He opened his mouth but hesitated. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity involving a vehicle matching this description." Elliot's eyes narrowed. He looked over at Vanessa, who stood firm, her gown shimmering, her dignity intact. Then he turned back to the officer. "A woman, well-dressed, coming from a public event, driving a registered sedan, is your definition of suspicious?" The officer didn't respond. The younger officer next to him looked away, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Of who exactly they had stopped. Elliot stepped closer. "Did she give you permission to search her vehicle?" The silence that followed was louder than any siren. "Did you have a warrant? Any real reason beyond a vague accusation?" The lead officer shifted uncomfortably. "We were just following procedure, sir." Elliot's tone darkened. "No, you weren't. You were following a presumption. And now you've not only violated protocol, you've violated her rights." Vanessa, now standing beside her husband, added quietly, "They wouldn't even let me make a phone call." "You treated her like a suspect from the moment you saw her," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the thick air. "That's not just unprofessional. It's unacceptable." By now, more bystanders had gathered, filming, whispering. The flashing police lights bathed the pavement in red and blue, but the mood had shifted entirely. The officers were no longer in control. And they knew it. Elliot crossed his arms. "Call your supervisor. Now." The lead officer hesitated but finally lifted his radio. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor at this location. Immediately." Vanessa remained silent, her posture unshaken. But deep inside, a shift had begun. Not just in the moment, but in what would come next. Because this was no longer just a stop. It was a spark. The flashing lights continued to spin atop the patrol cars as the quiet suburban street of Oak Ridge Lane became the backdrop for a confrontation that no one present would forget. Phones recorded. Murmurs rose. But the only voices that mattered now were those standing beneath the cold glow of authority. Elliot Monroe, police commissioner of Silverwood County, stood with his arms crossed, unwavering in front of the officers who had just searched his wife's vehicle without a shred of legal cause. And beside him, Vanessa Monroe, elegant and resolute, kept her chin high despite the humiliation she had endured. The lead officer, Sergeant Tom Kessler, had just radioed for a supervisor. His voice had barely concealed his reluctance. The damage was done, and he knew it. Elliot's voice broke the silence again, lower this time, but no less firm. "You've violated policy. You've violated protocol. You've violated trust." Kessler straightened defensively. "Sir, we were responding to a report." "A call about suspicious movement," Elliot cut him off. "Suspicious movement? Be specific, Sergeant." "What exactly in my wife's behavior justified pulling her out of her car and turning her trunk inside out?" Kessler faltered. Elliot took a step closer, each word weighed and measured. "Let me guess. Wrong time of night? Wrong kind of car? Or just the wrong kind of woman?" The younger officer, Patrolman Kyle Dorsey, shifted uncomfortably at his partner's side. He'd started the night with routine assumptions and now stood beneath the glare of accountability. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize or defend, but thought better of it. Vanessa spoke then, her voice calm but edged with fatigue. "You didn't ask for my consent. You didn't explain anything. And when I asked to call my husband, you denied me that too." Elliot turned to her with a softness in his eyes. "You shouldn't have had to go through that. Not ever. Especially not here." A sleek department cruiser pulled up. Out stepped Captain Lillian Hart, a supervisor known for her poise and political tact. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the scene, the crowd, the lights, the unmistakable posture of Commissioner Monroe standing in defense of his wife. "Commissioner," she greeted him respectfully, approaching with purpose. "What's the situation?" "I suggest you ask Sergeant Kessler and Officer Dorsey," Elliot replied. "They stopped my wife with no legitimate reason, searched her car without consent or warrant, and denied her the basic right to call her husband." Hart's expression tightened. She turned sharply toward Kessler. "Is this true, Sergeant?" Kessler looked down, then nodded faintly. "Yes, ma'am." Hart exhaled, visibly containing her reaction. "Commissioner, I assure you this will be addressed." "No," Elliot interrupted. "This will be addressed here, now, in front of every person watching. Because it didn't happen in secret, and it won't be cleaned up behind closed doors." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone shouted, "Accountability." Hart nodded once, gravely. "Understood." Elliot's voice rose just enough to carry over the street. "Let me be clear, what happened here is not just about my wife. It's about every person who's ever been treated like a suspect instead of a citizen. And this time, the system doesn't get to look the other way." Kessler's eyes darted between Vanessa, Elliot, and the gathering crowd. Dorsey stood frozen, jaw clenched. Vanessa stepped forward then, not as a wife, but as a woman who had been wronged. "You see someone well-dressed, driving alone at night, and you assume she's hiding something? You see skin before you see character. That's the real problem." The crowd, previously whispering, now clapped quietly in support. A few people lowered their phones to simply listen. Captain Hart turned back toward Kessler and Dorsey. "You're both to return to the station. Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative leave pending internal review." Kessler's shoulders sagged. "But ma'am," Dorsey began. Hart's voice was final. "No. That's all." The two officers walked to their cruiser in silence, watched by dozens of eyes and one unflinching commissioner. When the vehicle drove away, the mood shifted again. The crowd slowly dispersed, some still recording, others shaking hands with Elliot or offering soft words to Vanessa. But the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. That night, footage of the incident hit the internet. The video, capturing Vanessa in her gown, calm and composed, Elliot arriving in uniform, the confrontation with the officers, was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Under hashtags like hashtag Justice for Vanessa, hashtag Monroe Incident, and hashtag Silence is Not Safety, the story ignited conversations across the country. News anchors replayed the clip on every major network. Headlines asked, "What happens when police misjudge the wrong woman?" By morning, Vanessa and Elliot sat at their kitchen table, both dressed casually but bearing the weight of an unexpected storm. Vanessa sipped her coffee slowly, her posture still upright despite fatigue. Elliot scrolled through his phone, reading comments, reactions, and news reports. "They're calling it the Monroe Incident," he murmured, setting the phone down. Vanessa looked up. "This isn't about just me," she said. "It's about what it represents. How many people go through this and don't have someone to call? Someone with power?" Elliot nodded, his expression hard. "I've spent 20 years trying to clean this house from the inside. Last night showed me how far we still have to go." She reached across the table, taking his hand. "Then let's go further." By mid-morning, the town of Silverwood no longer belonged to its quiet reputation. The confrontation on Oak Ridge Lane had spread like wildfire. News vans now lined the police headquarters. Community leaders flooded inboxes with calls for accountability. A petition demanding justice for Vanessa Monroe had gathered over 200,000 signatures in just 12 hours. But inside their home, Vanessa and Elliot Monroe remained steady. They had spoken very little since dawn. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew what was coming. Elliot stood by the living room window, staring at the driveway. The same SUV that had carried him to the scene the night before now sat idle, dark and waiting. Vanessa, in a navy blouse and slacks, stood behind him, coffee in hand, composed as always. A knock echoed through the hallway. It was Detective Ray Torres, Elliot's long-trusted colleague. "Commissioner, it's time." Elliot nodded. Together, they rode in silence to the emergency press conference. The briefing room was filled beyond capacity, citizens, journalists, civil rights advocates, and officers, all packed into a space that suddenly felt too small for what needed to be said. As he approached the podium, Elliot could feel the pressure pressing against his shoulders. Not just as a commissioner, but as a husband, a black man, a public servant trying to uphold a system that had just exposed its deepest cracks. Vanessa stood beside him. Her presence alone was thunder. The flashes from the cameras began before he even opened his mouth. "What happened last night," Elliot began, his voice calm but resonant, "was not just an error. It was a violation of the most basic principles of public trust." He paused. "My wife, Vanessa Monroe, was stopped, detained, and searched without probable cause. She was treated not as a citizen, but as a suspect, despite doing absolutely nothing wrong." The room was silent. The weight of his words pressed down on every shoulder. "This was not a misunderstanding," he continued. "It was a consequence of bias, implicit or otherwise. It was a failure of training, of accountability, and of culture." He turned slightly toward Vanessa, who nodded once, resolute. "That ends today." The room erupted in applause. But Elliot didn't smile. He raised a hand for silence. "I have placed the officers involved on administrative leave pending a full investigation. But this is not about 3 officers. This is about a system we must confront." He took a breath. "Effective immediately, the Silverwood County Police Department will launch a department-wide reform initiative. That includes mandatory implicit bias training for all active duty officers, body camera audits, and the establishment of a citizen oversight advisory board to ensure transparency in all civilian complaints." The crowd leaned in. This was no longer damage control. This was a pivot point. "We cannot change what happened last night. but we can make damn sure it doesn't happen again." He stepped back and gestured for Vanessa. She approached the microphone, standing tall. "When I was pulled over," she said, her voice unwavering, "I did everything right. I was calm. I complied. I gave them no reason to suspect me. And yet, I was treated like a problem, not a person." Her words pierced the silence. "I wasn't seen as someone's wife. I wasn't seen as a community leader. I wasn't seen at all. I was judged the moment they saw me, and that judgment stripped me of my dignity." A pause. "But I stand here not for revenge. I stand here for everyone who's ever faced what I did and didn't have a platform to speak from. For every woman, every person of color, every quiet voice in the shadows. We deserve better." The applause this time was deafening. Later that day, the fallout rippled further. One of the officers involved, Patrolman Kyle Dorsey, resigned, issuing a public statement admitting a lapse in judgment and failure to uphold the oath. Sergeant Tom Kessler was reassigned pending a disciplinary hearing. But it wasn't just the officers facing consequences. Silverwood County's Civilian Review Board, long dormant, was restructured and activated. Weekly town halls were scheduled to rebuild dialogue between police and community. And Elliott himself initiated sweeping audits across all traffic stop data from the last 5 years, determined to uncover patterns and hold people accountable. Meanwhile, Vanessa had become more than a victim. She had become a voice. She appeared on morning talk shows, shared her experience at civil rights panels, and joined local organizers in advocating for statewide police reform legislation. "This wasn't a career I planned," she told one reporter. "But silence isn't an option anymore. If my story has power, I'll use it." Weeks passed. Then months. And something incredible began to happen. Officers across Silverwood began requesting additional training, voluntarily. Youth leaders organized forums where teens could speak directly to officers about fear and mistrust. Trust, slowly and painfully, began to rebuild. And through it all, Vanessa and Elliott never wavered. They knew the road to justice wasn't paved in applause. It was paved in action. Months after the night that had nearly broken her spirit, Vanessa Monroe stood behind a podium once more, this time in a sunlit auditorium packed with students, educators, police officers, and everyday citizens. The polished wood floor gleamed beneath her heels, and behind her, a large banner read, "Silverwood Unity Forum, bridging the gap between justice and community." She looked out across the room, her expression calm, radiant, but resolute. She hadn't intended to become an activist. But life, and injustice, had chosen her. "When I was pulled over that night," Vanessa said, voice clear and strong, "I wasn't just one woman in a gown. I was every person who's ever been reduced to suspicion because of the color of their skin or the neighborhood they were in. I did everything right, and it still wasn't enough." The audience was silent, listening. "But what I learned," she continued, "is that sometimes the most painful moments become the ones that spark real change. If we're willing to speak up, and if others are willing to listen." Her words echoed across the space, landing like seeds. In the months since the Oak Ridge Lane incident, Silverwood County had become a national symbol of reform in action. The body camera policies Elliott had implemented were now being replicated in other counties across the state. Racial bias training had gone from a PowerPoint checkbox to mandatory workshops facilitated by outside experts. Most significantly, the Community Oversight Advisory Board, co-chaired by local activists and former officers, was now an active watchdog body reviewing use of force cases and traffic stop data transparently. But it hadn't been easy. There had been protests. There had been pushback, from officers who felt blamed, from officials afraid of scrutiny, and even from citizens who claimed the Monroes were overreacting. But Elliott had stood firm. Back at police headquarters, Commissioner Elliott Monroe had built an open-door culture. Patrol briefings now included discussions about empathy, not just enforcement. Officers who showed exceptional community engagement were publicly recognized. And he had personally overseen the creation of an internal Equity Watch unit that reviewed department data for disparities in arrests, stops, and complaints. "I didn't sign up to make headlines," Elliot had told a town council session. "But if we're going to wear a badge, then we should be worthy of the trust that badge is supposed to represent." The public began to notice. A recent survey showed community trust in Silverwood PD had risen by nearly 30% since the reforms began. Violent interactions were down. Complaints had decreased. And a growing number of residents now attended ride-along programs and town forums to learn how policing worked from the inside. But even as numbers improved, Vanessa never let the mission get comfortable. "This isn't about metrics," she reminded a news anchor during a live interview. "This is about humanity. It's about making sure no one else has to call their spouse in fear, just for doing everything right." She had taken her platform and used it wisely. Vanessa had joined a national civil rights task force focused on police accountability. She spoke at universities. She mentored young women interested in law and policy. And above all, she listened to the stories people told her in airports, on sidewalks, at rallies. Stories of stops gone wrong. Of dignity stripped. Of injustice unnoticed. "They tell me what they couldn't say back then," she told Elliot one evening, sitting across from him at their kitchen table. "And now I get to carry it forward." Elliot smiled at her then, a rare full smile. "You've always carried more than most. Now you just have a microphone." He had grown, too, not just as a commissioner, but as a man who now understood the silent weight his community had been carrying long before that night. He made time to speak at youth centers. He held one-on-one meetings with officers who had received complaints, not to punish, but to educate. He let stories guide his leadership. And their marriage, scarred by the public spotlight but strengthened by shared purpose, held steady. One evening, as they walked through a local park during the city's Unity Day celebration, a teenage girl approached them. She was no more than 16, nervous but determined. "Mrs. Monroe?" she asked. "I just wanted to say, what you said on the news made me feel seen. I want to be a lawyer now. Because of you." Vanessa knelt a little to meet her eye level. "Then promise me something," she said softly. "Be the voice for someone who hasn't found theirs yet." The girl nodded. The incident on Oak Ridge Lane had faded from the daily headlines, but its ripples were everywhere, in policy, in people, in perception. The Monroes never let the moment become about revenge. They had turned pain into purpose, injustice into institution building, and silence into dialogue. Their story proved something vital, that dignity should never be negotiable, and that true reform doesn't come from one speech, but from relentless, consistent action. And in the end, they showed that real change isn't just about who's in power. It's about who's willing to use that power to protect those without it. Sometimes, life teaches us the most powerful lessons in the moments we least expect, on an ordinary drive, in a moment of calm turned chaos, or through a silence that demands to be broken. Vanessa Monroe did everything right. She followed the law, carried herself with dignity, and spoke with grace. Yet she was still treated as a threat, not because of her actions, but because of deeply rooted bias. What followed wasn't just a confrontation, it became a mirror for a community, a nation, and a system long overdue for reflection. This story reminds us that dignity is not a reward, it's a right. Respect should never depend on how you look, where you live, or who you are married to. It should be the baseline for every human interaction. And when that dignity is denied, it's not enough to whisper disapproval, we must speak, stand, and demand better. Elliot Monroe, even with power in his hands, chose not revenge, but reform. That's a lesson in leadership. Real change doesn't come from anger, it comes from integrity, persistence, and the courage to challenge injustice without becoming unjust. To every adult who's lived through unfairness and every senior who's seen history repeat, this story says, your voice still matters. Your wisdom still leads. And your courage can still spark change. Speech Balloon, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? If this message moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next story that speaks truth to power.